The right of my line rested near the bank of Snake Creek, a short distance above the bridge built by the troops to connect Crump's Landing and Pittsburgh Landing. Sherman had positioned some troops in a log house and outbuildings overlooking both the bridge, over which Wallace was expected, and the creek above that point. In this position, Sherman was frequently attacked before night, but held the point until he voluntarily abandoned it to advance, making room for Lew. Wallace, who arrived after dark. In front of our left, there was a deep ravine. The Tennessee River was very high, and the ravine held water to a considerable depth. Here, the enemy made a last desperate effort to turn our flank, but was repelled. The gunboats Tyler and Lexington, commanded by Gwynn and Shirk, along with artillery under Webster, aided the army and effectively checked the enemy's further progress. Before any of Buell's troops had reached the west bank of the Tennessee, firing had nearly ceased. Any attempt by the enemy to advance had stopped. There was some artillery firing from an unseen enemy, with some shells passing beyond us, but I do not recall hearing the whistle of a single musket ball. As Buell's troops arrived in the dusk, several regiments marched partway down the hill and fired briskly for some minutes, but I do not believe any of them were injured. The attack had lost its momentum. General Lew. Wallace, with 5,000 effective men, arrived after the firing had ceased for the day and was placed on the right. Thus, night fell, Wallace arrived, and Nelson's division advanced, but none, except Knight, arrived in time to materially assist the gallant men who defended Shiloh on that first day against large odds. Buell's loss on April 6th was 2 men killed and 1 wounded, all members of the 36th Indiana Infantry. The Army of the Tennessee lost at least 7,000 men that day. The presence of a few regiments of Buell's army on the west bank before firing ceased had no effect on preventing the capture of Pittsburgh Landing. I was so confident before the firing ceased on the 6th that victory would come to our arms the next day if we took the initiative that I visited each division commander personally before reinforcements arrived. I instructed them to deploy heavy lines of skirmishers in the morning, push them forward until they found the enemy, and engage the enemy as soon as they were found. To Sherman, I recounted the assault at Fort Donelson and said that the same tactics would win at Shiloh. Victory was assured when Wallace arrived, even without further support. However, I was pleased to see Buell's reinforcements and credited them with doing all they could. During the night of the 6th, the rest of Nelson's division from Buell's army crossed the river and were prepared to advance in the morning, forming the left wing. Crittenden's and McCook's divisions arrived on the west bank early on the 7th. Buell personally commanded them. My command was nearly doubled in numbers and efficiency. During that night there was torrential rain, and our troops were exposed without shelter. I established my headquarters under a tree a few hundred yards back from the riverbank. My swollen ankle, injured from my horse's fall the preceding Friday night, caused me great pain and prevented rest. Some time after midnight, unable to bear the storm and continuous pain, I moved back to the log house under the bank, which had been turned into a hospital. Throughout the night, wounded men were brought in, their wounds dressed and amputations performed as necessary. The sight was more agonizing than facing enemy fire, so I returned to my tree in the rain. The morning of the 7th revealed the enemy in the camps occupied by our troops before the battle, more than a mile back from the Confederates' most advanced position the day before. They had not yet learned of Buell's arrival. Possibly they withdrew to seek shelter in our tents during the rain and to avoid the shells dropped by the gunboats every 15 minutes throughout the night. The Union troops' positions on the 7th were General Lew, Wallace on the right, Sherman on his left, followed by McClernand and then Hurlbut. Buell's Nelson was on the extreme left, next to the river, followed by Crittenden, then McCook forming the extreme right of Buell's command. My old command constituted the right wing, while the troops under Buell formed the left wing of the army. These positions were maintained throughout the day until the enemy was driven from the field. The battle became general along the line very quickly, with everything favouring the Union side as we became the attacking party. The enemy was driven back all day, as we had been the day before, until finally he beat a precipitate retreat. The last point held by him was near the road leading from the landing to Corinth, on the left of Sherman and right of McClernand. About 3 o'clock, being near that point and seeing that the enemy was giving way everywhere else, I gathered up a couple of regiments, or parts of regiments, from troops nearby, formed them in line of battle, and marched them forward, going in front myself to prevent premature or long-range firing. At this point, there was a clearing between us and the enemy favourable for charging, although exposed. I knew the enemy were ready to break, and only wanted a little encouragement from us to go quickly and join their friends who had started earlier. After marching to within musket range, I stopped and let the troops pass. The command, charge, was given and was executed with loud cheers and with a run, when the last of the enemy broke. 7. During this second day of the battle, I had been moving from right to left and back to see for myself the progress made. In the early part of the afternoon, while riding with Colonel Macpherson and Major Hawkins, then my chief commissary, we got beyond the left of our troops. We were moving along the northern edge of a clearing, very leisurely, toward the river above the landing. There did not appear to be an enemy to our right until suddenly a battery with musketry opened upon us from the edge of the woods on the other side of the clearing. The shells and balls whistled about our ears very fast for about a minute. I do not think it took us longer than that to get out of range and out of sight. In the sudden start we made, Major Hawkins lost his hat. He did not stop to pick it up. When we arrived at a perfectly safe position, we halted to take an account of damages. Macpherson's horse was panting as if ready to drop. On examination, it was found that a ball had struck him forward of the flank just back of the saddle and had gone entirely through. In a few minutes, the poor beast dropped dead. He had given no sign of injury until we came to a stop. A ball had struck the metal scabbard of my sword just below the hilt and broken it nearly off. Before the battle was over, it had broken off entirely. There were 3 of us. One had lost a horse, killed, one a hat, and one a sword scabbard. All were thankful that it was no worse. After the rain of the night before and the frequent and heavy rains for some days previous, the roads were almost impassable. The enemy carrying his artillery and supply trains over them in his retreat made them still worse for troops following. I wanted to pursue, but had not the heart to order the men who had fought desperately for 2 days, lying in the mud and rain whenever not fighting, and I did, 8, not feel disposed to positively order Buell or any part of his command to pursue. Although the senior in rank at the time, I had been so only a few weeks. Buell was, and had been for some time past, a department commander, while I commanded only a district. I did not meet Buell in person until too late to get troops ready and pursue with effect, but had I seen him at the moment of the last charge, I should have at least requested him to follow. I rode forward several miles the day after the battle, and found that the enemy had dropped much, if not all, of their provisions, some ammunition and the extra wheels of their caissons, lightening their loads to enable them to get off their guns. About 5 miles out, we found their field hospital abandoned. An immediate pursuit must have resulted in the capture of a considerable number of prisoners and probably some guns. Shiloh was the severest battle fought at the West during the war, and but few in the East equalled it for hard, determined fighting. I saw an open field in our possession on the second day, over which the Confederates had made repeated charges the day before, so covered with dead that it would have been possible to walk across the clearing in any direction, stepping on dead bodies without a foot touching the ground. On our side, National and Confederate troops were mingled together in about equal proportions, but on the remainder of the field nearly all were Confederates. On one part, which had evidently not been ploughed for several years, probably because the land was poor, bushes had grown up, some to the height of 8 or 10 feet. There was not one of these left standing unpierced by bullets. The smaller ones were all cut down. Contrary to all my experience up to that time, and to the experience of the army I was then commanding, we were on the defensive. We were without entrenchments or defensive advantages of any sort, and more than half the army engaged the first day was without experience or even drill as soldiers. The officers with them, except the division commanders and possibly 2 or 3 of the brigade commanders, were equally inexperienced in war. The result was a Union victory that gave the men who achieved it great confidence in themselves ever after. The enemy fought bravely, but they had started out to defeat and destroy an army and capture a position. They failed in both, with very heavy loss in killed and wounded, and must have gone back discouraged and convinced that the Yankee was not an enemy to be despised. After the battle, I gave verbal instructions to division commanders to let the regiments send out parties to bury their own dead, and to detail parties under commissioned officers from each division to bury the Confederate dead in their respective fronts and to report the numbers so buried. The latter part of these instructions was not carried out by all, but they were by those sent from Sherman's division and by some of the parties sent out by McClernand. The heaviest loss sustained by the enemy was in front of these 2 divisions. The criticism has often been made that the Union troops should have been entrenched at Shiloh. Up to that time, the pick and spade had been but little resorted to at the west. I had, however, taken this subject under consideration soon after reassuming command in the field, and, as already stated, my only military engineer reported unfavourably. Besides this, the troops with me, officers and men, needed discipline and drill more than they did experience with the pick, shovel and axe. Reinforcements were arriving almost daily, composed of troops that had been hastily thrown together into companies and regiments, fragments of incomplete organisations, the men and officers strangers to each other. Under all these circumstances, I concluded that drill and discipline were worth more to our men than fortifications. General Buell was a brave, intelligent officer with as much professional pride and ambition of a commendable sort as I ever knew. I had been 2 years at West Point with him and had served with him afterwards, in garrison and in the Mexican War, several years more. He was not given in early life or in mature years to forming intimate acquaintances. He was studious by habit and commanded the confidence and respect of all who knew him. He was a strict disciplinarian, and perhaps did not distinguish sufficiently between the volunteer who enlisted for the war and the soldier who serves in time of peace. One system embraced men who risked life for a principle, and often men of social standing, competence, or wealth and independence of character. The other includes, as a rule, only men who could not do as well in any other occupation. General Buell became an object of harsh criticism later, some going so far as to challenge his loyalty. No one who knew him ever believed him capable of a dishonourable act, and nothing could be more dishonourable than to accept high rank and command in war and then betray the trust. When I came into command of the army in 1864, I requested the Secretary of War to restore General Buell to duty. After the war, during the summer of 1865, I travelled considerably through the north and was everywhere met by large numbers of people. Everyone had his opinion about the manner in which the war had been conducted, who among the generals had failed, how and why. Correspondents of the press were ever on hand to hear every word dropped, and were not always disposed to report correctly what did not confirm their preconceived notions, either about the conduct of the war or the individuals concerned in it. The opportunity frequently occurred for me to defend General Buell against what I believed to be most unjust charges. On one occasion, a correspondent put in my mouth the very charge I had so often refuted, of disloyalty. This brought from General Buell a very severe retort, which I saw in the New York World some time before I received the letter itself. I could very well understand his grievance at seeing untrue and disgraceful charges apparently sustained by an officer who, at the time, was at the head of the army. I replied to him, but not through the press. I kept no copy of my letter, nor did I ever see it in print, neither did I receive an answer. General Albert Sidney Johnston, who commanded the Confederate forces at the beginning of the battle, was disabled by a wound on the afternoon of the first day. This wound, as I understood afterwards, was not necessarily fatal or even dangerous. But he was a man who would not abandon what he deemed an important trust in the face of danger, and consequently continued in the saddle, commanding until so exhausted by the loss of blood that he had to be taken from his horse, and soon after died. The news was not long in reaching our side, and I suppose was quite an encouragement to the national soldiers. I had known Johnston slightly in the Mexican War, and later as an officer in the regular army. He was a man of high character and ability. His contemporaries at West Point, and officers generally who came to know him personally later, and who remained on our side, expected him to prove the most formidable man to meet that the Confederacy would produce. I once wrote that nothing occurred in his brief command of an army to prove or disprove the high estimate that had been placed upon his military ability. But after studying the orders and dispatches of Johnston, I am compelled to materially modify my views of that officer's qualifications as a soldier. My judgment now is that he was vacillating and undecided in his actions. All the disasters in Kentucky and Tennessee were so discouraging to the authorities in Richmond that Jefferson Davis wrote an unofficial letter to Johnston expressing his own anxiety and that of the public, and saying that he had made such defence as was dictated by long friendship, but that in the absence of a report he needed facts. The letter was not a reprimand in direct terms, but it was evidently as much felt as though it had been one. General Johnston raised another army as rapidly as he could, and fortified or strongly entrenched at Corinth. He knew the national troops were preparing to attack him in his chosen position, but he had evidently become so disturbed at the results of his operations that he resolved to strike out in an offensive campaign which would restore all that was lost, and if successful accomplish still more. We have the authority of his son and biographer for saying that his plan was to attack the forces at Shiloh and crush them, then to cross the Tennessee and destroy the army of Buell and push the war across the Ohio River. The design was a bold one, but we have the same authority for saying that in the execution Johnston showed vacillation and indecision. He left Corinth on the 2nd of April and was not ready to attack until the 6th. The distance his army had to march was less than 20 miles. Beauregard, his second in command, was opposed to the attack for 2 reasons. First, he thought, if let alone the national troops would attack the Confederates in their entrenchments. Second, we were in ground of our own choosing and would necessarily be entrenched. Johnston not only listened to the objection of Beauregard to an attack, but held a council of war on the subject on the morning of the 5th. On the evening of the same day, he was in consultation with some of his generals on the same subject, and still again on the morning of the 6th. During this last consultation, and before a decision had been reached, the battle began by the national troops opening fire on the enemy. This seemed to settle the question as to whether there was to be any battle of Shiloh. It also seems to me to settle the question as to whether there was a surprise. I do not question the personal courage of General Johnston or his ability, but he did not win the distinction predicted for him by many of his friends. He did prove that as a general he was overestimated. General Beauregard was next in rank to Johnston and succeeded to the command, which he retained to the close of the battle and during the subsequent retreat on Corinth, as well as in the siege of that place. His tactics have been severely criticized by Confederate writers, but I do not believe his fallen chief could have done any better under the circumstances. Some of these critics claim that Shiloh was won when Johnston fell, and that if he had not fallen, the army under me would have been annihilated or captured. Ifs defeated the Confederates at Shiloh. There is little doubt that we would have been disgracefully beaten if all the shells and bullets fired by us had passed harmlessly over the enemy, and if all of theirs had taken effect. Commanding generals are liable to be killed during engagements, and the fact that when he was shot Johnston was leading a brigade to induce it to make a charge which had been repeatedly ordered is evidence that there was neither the universal demoralization on our side nor the unbounded confidence on theirs which has been claimed. There was in fact no hour during the day when I doubted the eventual defeat of the enemy, although I was disappointed that reinforcements so near at hand did not arrive at an earlier hour. The description of the Battle of Shiloh, given by Colonel W.M. Preston Johnston, is very graphic and well told. The reader will imagine that he can see each blow struck, a demoralized and broken mob of Union soldiers, each blow sending the enemy more demoralized than ever towards the Tennessee River, which was a little more than 2 miles away at the beginning of the onset. If the reader does not stop to inquire why, with such Confederate success for more than 12 hours of hard fighting, the national troops were not all killed, captured, or driven into the river, he will regard the pen picture as perfect. But I witnessed the fight from the national side from 8 o'clock in the morning until night closed the contest. I see but little in the description that I can recognize. The Confederate troops fought well and deserve commendation enough for their bravery and endurance on the 6th of April, without detracting from their antagonists or claiming anything more than their just dues. The reports of the enemy show that their condition at the end of the first day was deplorable. Their losses in killed and wounded had been very heavy, and their stragglers had been quite as numerous as on the national side, with the difference that those of the enemy left the field entirely and were not brought back to their respective commands for many days. On the Union side, but few of the stragglers fell back further than the landing on the river, and many of these were in line for duty on the second day. The admissions of the highest Confederate officers engaged at Shiloh make the claim of a victory for them absurd. The victory was not to either party until the battle was over. It was then a Union victory, in which the armies of the Tennessee and the Ohio both participated. But the Army of the Tennessee fought the entire rebel army on the 6th and held it at bay until near night, and night alone closed the conflict, and not the 3 regiments of Nelson's division. The Confederates fought with courage at Shiloh, but the particular skill claimed I could not and still cannot see, though there is nothing to criticize except the claims put forward for it since. But the Confederate claimants for superiority in strategy, superiority in generalship, and superiority in dash and prowess are not so unjust to the Union troops engaged at Shiloh as are many Northern writers. The troops on both sides were American, and united they need not fear any foreign foe. It is possible that the Southern man started in with a little more dash than his Northern brother, but he was correspondingly less enduring. The endeavour of the enemy on the first day was simply to hurl their men against ours, first at one point, then at another, sometimes at several points at once. This they did with daring and energy, until at night the rebel troops were worn out. Our effort during the same time was to be prepared to resist assaults wherever made. The object of the Confederates on the second day was to get away with as much of their army and material as possible. Ours then was to drive them from our front and to capture or destroy as great a part as possible of their men and material. We were successful in driving them back, but not so successful in captures as if farther pursuit could have been made. As it was, we captured or recaptured on the second day about as much artillery as we lost on the first, and, leaving out the one great capture of Prentiss, we took more prisoners on Monday than the enemy gained from us on Sunday. On the 6th, Sherman lost 7 pieces of artillery, McClernand 6, Prentiss 8, and Hurlbut 2 batteries. On the 7th, Sherman captured 7 guns, McClernand 3 and the Army of the Ohio 20. At Shiloh, the effective strength of the Union forces on the morning of the 6th was 33,000 men. Lou. Wallace brought 5,000 more after nightfall. Beauregard reported the enemy's strength at 40,955. According to the custom of enumeration in the South, this number probably excluded every man enlisted as a musician or detailed as a guard or nurse, and all commissioned officers, everybody who did not carry a musket or serve a cannon. With us, everybody in the field receiving pay from the government is counted. Excluding the troops who fled, panic-stricken, before they had fired a shot, there was not a time during the 6th when we had more than 25,000 men in line. On the 7th, Buell brought 20,000 more. Of his remaining 2 divisions, Thomas's did not reach the field during the engagement. Wood's arrived before firing had ceased, but not in time to be of much service. Our loss in the 2 days' fight was 1,754 killed, 8,408 wounded, and 2,185 missing. Of these, 2,103 were in the Army of the Ohio. Beauregard reported a total loss of 10,699, of whom 1,728 were killed, 8,012 wounded, and 957 missing. This estimate must be incorrect. We buried, by actual count, more of the enemy's dead in front of the divisions of McClernand and Sherman alone than here reported, and 4,000 was the estimate of the burial parties of the whole field. Beauregard reports the Confederate force on the 6th at over 40,000, and their total loss during the 2 days at 10,699, and at the same time declares that he could put only 20,000 men in battle on the morning of the 7th. The Navy gave hearty support to the army at Shiloh, as indeed it always did both before and subsequently when I was in command. The nature of the ground was such, however, that on this occasion it could do nothing in aid of the troops until sundown on the first day. The country was broken and heavily timbered, cutting off all view of the battle from the river, so that friends would be as much in danger from fire from the gunboats as the foe. But about sundown, when the national troops were back in their last position, the right of the enemy was near the river and exposed to the fire of the 2 gunboats, which was delivered with vigour and effect. After nightfall, when firing had entirely ceased on land, the commander of the fleet informed himself approximately of the position of our troops and suggested the idea of dropping a shell within the lines of the enemy every 15 minutes during the night. This was done with effect, as is proved by the Confederate reports. Up to the Battle of Shiloh the Firm, as well as thousands of other citizens, believed that the rebellion against the government would collapse suddenly and soon if a decisive victory could be gained over any of its armies. Donelson and Henry were such victories. An army of more than 21,000 men was captured or destroyed. Bowling Green, Columbus, and Hickman, Kentucky fell in consequence, and Clarksville and Nashville, Tennessee, the last 2 with an immense amount of stores, also fell into our hands. The Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, from their mouths to the head of navigation, were secured. But when Confederate armies were collected which not only attempted to hold a line farther south, from Memphis to Chattanooga, Knoxville, and on to the Atlantic, but assumed the offensive and made such a gallant effort to regain what had been lost, then, indeed, I gave up all idea of saving the Union except by complete conquest. Up to that time it had been the policy of our army, certainly of that portion commanded by me, to protect the property of the citizens whose territory was invaded, without regard to their sentiments, whether Union or secession. After this, however, I regarded it as humane to both sides to protect the persons of those found at their homes, but to consume everything that could be used to support or supply armies. Protection was still continued over such supplies as were within lines held by us and which we expected to continue to hold, but such supplies within the reach of Confederate armies I regarded as much contraband as arms or ordnance stores. Their destruction was accomplished without bloodshed and tended to the same result as the destruction of armies. I continued this policy to the close of the war. Promiscuous pillaging, however, was discouraged and punished. Instructions were always given to take provisions and forage under the direction of commissioned officers who should give receipts to owners, if at home, and turn the property over to officers of the quartermaster or commissary departments to be issued as if furnished from our northern depots. But much was destroyed without receipts to owners, when it could not be brought within our lines, and would otherwise have gone to the support of secession and rebellion. This policy, I believe, exercised a material influence in hastening the end. The Battle of Shiloh, or Pittsburgh Landing, has been perhaps less understood, or to state the case more accurately, more persistently misunderstood than any other engagement between national and Confederate troops during the entire rebellion. Correct reports of the battle have been published, notably by Sherman, Badeau, and, in a speech before a meeting of veterans, by General Prentice. But all of these appeared long subsequent to the close of the rebellion, and after public opinion had been most erroneously formed. I myself made no report to General Halleck, further than was contained in a letter, written immediately after the battle informing him that an engagement had been fought and announcing the result. A few days afterwards, General Halleck moved his headquarters to Pittsburgh Landing and assumed command of the troops in the field. Although next to him in rank and nominally in command of my old district and army, I was ignored as much as if I had been at the most distant point of territory within my jurisdiction. And although I was in command of all the troops engaged at Shiloh, I was not permitted to see one of the reports of General Buell or his subordinates in that battle until they were published by the War Department long after the event. For this reason, I never made a full official report of this engagement. General Halleck arrived at Pittsburgh Landing on the 11th of April and immediately assumed command in the field. On the 21st, General Pope arrived with an army 30,000 strong, fresh from the capture of Island No. 10 in the Mississippi River. He went into camp at Hamburg, landing 5 miles above Pittsburgh. Halleck had now 3 armies: the Army of the Ohio, Buell commanding, the Army of the Mississippi, Pope commanding, and the Army of the Tennessee. His orders divided the combined force into the right wing, reserve, centre, and left wing. Major General George H. Thomas, who had been in Buell's army, was transferred with his division to the Army of the Tennessee and given command of the right wing, composed of all of that army except McClernand's and Lew. Wallace's divisions. McClernand was assigned to the command of the reserve, composed of his own and Lew. Wallace's divisions. Buell commanded the centre, the Army of the Ohio, and Pope the left wing, the Army of the Mississippi. I was named second in command of the whole, and was also supposed to be in command of the right wing and reserve. Orders were given to all the commanders engaged at Shiloh to send in their reports without delay to department headquarters. Those from officers of the Army of the Tennessee were sent through me, but from the Army of the Ohio they were sent by General Buell without passing through my hands. General Halleck ordered me, verbally, to send in my report, but I positively declined on the ground that he had received the reports of a part of the army engaged at Shiloh without their coming through me. He admitted that my refusal was justifiable under the circumstances, but explained that he had wanted to get the reports off before moving the command, and as fast as a report had come to him he had forwarded it to Washington. Preparations were at once made upon the arrival of the new commander for an advance on Corinth. Owl Creek on our right was bridged, and expeditions were sent to the northwest and west to ascertain if our position was being threatened from those quarters. The roads towards Corinth were corduroyed and new ones made. Lateral roads were also constructed, so that in case of necessity troops marching by different routes could reinforce each other. All commanders were cautioned against bringing on an engagement and informed in so many words that it would be better to retreat than to fight. By the 30th of April, all preparations were complete. The country west to the Mobile and Ohio Railroad had been reconnoitred, as well as the road to Corinth as far as Monterey, 12 miles from Pittsburgh. Everywhere small bodies of the enemy had been encountered, but they were observers and not in force to fight battles. Corinth, Mississippi, lies in a southwesterly direction from Pittsburgh Landing and about 19 miles away as the bird would fly, but probably 22 by the nearest wagon road. It is about 4 miles south of the line dividing the states of Tennessee and Mississippi, and at the junction of the Mississippi and Chattanooga Railroad with the Mobile and Ohio Road, which runs from Columbus to Mobile. From Pittsburgh to Corinth the land is rolling, but at no point reaching an elevation that makes high hills to pass over. In 1862, the greater part of the country was covered with forest with intervening clearings and houses. Underbrush was dense in the low grounds along the creeks and ravines, but generally not so thick on the high land as to prevent men passing through with ease. There are 2 small creeks running from north of the town and connecting some 4 miles south, where they form Bridge Creek, which empties into the Tuscumbia River. Corinth is on the ridge between these streams and is a naturally strong defensive position. The creeks are insignificant in volume of water, but the stream to the east widens out in front of the town into a swamp impassable in the presence of an enemy. On the crest of the west bank of this stream, The enemy was strongly entrenched. Corinth was a valuable strategic point for the enemy to hold, and consequently a valuable one for us to possess ourselves of. We ought to have seized it immediately after the fall of Donelson and Nashville, when it could have been taken without a battle, but failing then, it should have been taken, without delay on the concentration of troops at Pittsburgh Landing after the Battle of Shiloh. In fact, the arrival of Pope should not have been awaited. There was no time from the Battle of Shiloh up to the evacuation of Corinth when the enemy would not have left if pushed. The demoralization among the Confederates from their defeats at Henry and Donelson, their long marches from Bowling Green, Columbus, and Nashville, and their failure at Shiloh, in fact, from having been driven out of Kentucky and Tennessee, was so great that a stand for the time would have been impossible. Beauregard made strenuous efforts to reinforce himself and partially succeeded. He appealed to the people of the Southwest for new regiments and received a few. A.S. Johnston had made efforts to reinforce in the same quarter before the Battle of Shiloh, but in a different way. He had Negroes sent out to him to take the place of teamsters, company cooks, and labourers in every capacity, so as to put all his white men into the ranks. The people, while willing to send their sons to the field, were not willing to part with their Negroes. It is only fair to state that they probably wanted their blacks to raise supplies for the army and for the families left at home. Beauregard, however, was reinforced by Van Dorn immediately after Shiloh with 17,000 men. Interior points, less exposed, were also depleted to add to the strength at Corinth. With these reinforcements and the new regiments, Beauregard had, during the month of May 1862, a large force on paper, but probably not much over 50,000 effective men. We estimated his strength at 70,000. Our own was, in round numbers, 120,000. The defensible nature of the ground at Corinth and the fortifications made 50,000 then enough to maintain their position against double that number for an indefinite time but for the demoralization spoken of. On the 30th of April, the Grand Army commenced its advance from Shiloh upon Corinth. The movement was a siege from the start to the close. The national troops were always behind entrenchments, except, of course, the small reconnoitring parties sent to the front to clear the way for an advance. Even the commanders of these parties were cautioned not to bring on an engagement. It is better to retreat than to fight. The enemy were constantly watching our advance, but as they were simply observers, there were but few engagements that even threatened to become battles. All the engagements fought ought to have served to encourage the enemy. Roads were again made in our front and again corduroyed. A line was entrenched, and the troops were advanced to the new position. Crossroads were constructed to these new positions to enable the troops to concentrate in case of attack. The national armies were thoroughly entrenched all the way from the Tennessee River to Corinth. For myself, I was little more than an observer. Orders were sent direct to the right wing or reserve, ignoring me, and advances were made from one line of entrenchments to another without notifying me. My position was so embarrassing, in fact, that I made several applications during the siege to be relieved. General Halleck kept his headquarters generally, if not all the time, with the right wing. Pope, being on the extreme left, did not see so much of his chief, and consequently got loose as it were at times. On the 3rd of May, he was at 7 Mile Creek with the main body of his command, but threw forward a division to Farmington, within 4 miles of Corinth. His troops had quite a little engagement at Farmington on that day, but carried the place with considerable loss to the enemy. There would then have been no difficulty in advancing the centre and right, so as to form a new line well up to the enemy, but Pope was ordered back to conform with the general line. On the 8th of May, he moved again, taking his whole force to Farmington, and pushed out 2 divisions close to the rebel line. Again he was ordered back. By the 4th of May, the centre and right wing reached Monterey, 12 miles out. Their advance was slow from there, for they entrenched with every forward movement. The left wing moved up again on the 25th of May, and entrenched itself close to the enemy. The creek with the marsh before described separated the 2 lines. Skirmishers 30 feet apart could have maintained either line at this point. Our centre and right were, at this time, extended so that the right of the right wing was probably 5 miles from Corinth and 4 from the works in their front. The creek, which was a formidable obstacle for either side to pass on our left, became a very slight obstacle on our right. Here the enemy occupied 2 positions. One of them, as much as 2 miles out from his main line, was on a commanding elevation and defended by an entrenched battery with infantry supports. A heavy wood intervened between this work and the national forces. In rear to the south there was a clearing extending a mile or more, and south of this clearing a log house which had been loopholed and was occupied by infantry. Sherman's division carried these 2 positions with some loss to himself, but with probably greater to the enemy, on the 28th of May, and on that day the investment of Corinth was complete, or as complete as it was ever made. Thomas's right now rested west of the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. Pope's left commanded the Memphis and Charleston Railroad east of Corinth. Some days before I had suggested to the commanding general that I thought if he would move the Army of the Mississippi at night by the rear of the centre and right, ready to advance at daylight, Pope would find no natural obstacle in his front, and I believed no serious artificial one. The ground, or works, occupied by our left could be held by a thin picket line, owing to the stream and swamp in front. To the right the troops would have a dry ridge to march over. I was silenced so quickly that I felt that possibly I had suggested an unmilitary movement. Later, probably on the 28th of May, General Logan, whose command was then on the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, said to me that the enemy had been evacuating for several days, and that if allowed he could go into Corinth with his brigade. Trains of cars were heard coming in and going out of Corinth constantly. Some of the men who had been engaged in various capacities on railroads before the war claimed that they could tell, by putting their ears to the rail, not only which way the trains were moving, but which trains were loaded and which were empty. They said loaded trains had been going out for several days and empty ones coming in. Subsequent events proved the correctness of their judgment. Beauregard published his orders for the evacuation of Corinth on the 26th of May and fixed the 29th for the departure of his troops, and on the 30th of May General Halleck had his whole army drawn up prepared for battle and announced in orders that there was every indication that our left was to be attacked that morning. Corinth had already been evacuated, and the national troops marched on and took possession without opposition. Everything had been destroyed or carried away. The Confederate commander had instructed his soldiers to cheer on the arrival of every train to create the impression among the Yankees that reinforcements were arriving. There was not a sick or wounded man left by the Confederates, nor stores of any kind. Some ammunition had been blown up, not removed, but the trophies of war were a few Quaker guns, logs of about the diameter of ordinary cannon, mounted on wheels of wagons and pointed in the most threatening manner towards us. The possession of Corinth by the national troops was of strategic importance, but the victory was barren in every other particular. It was nearly bloodless. It is a question whether the morale of the Confederate troops engaged at Corinth was not improved by the immunity with which they were permitted to remove all public property and then withdraw themselves. On our side, I know officers and men of the Army of the Tennessee, and I presume the same is true of those of the other commands, were disappointed at the result. They could not see how the mere occupation of places was to close the war while large and effective rebel armies existed. They believed that a well-directed attack would at least have partially destroyed the army defending Corinth. For myself, I am satisfied that Corinth could have been captured in a 2 days' campaign, commenced promptly on the arrival of reinforcements after the Battle of Shiloh. General Halleck at once commenced erecting fortifications around Corinth on a scale to indicate that this one point must be held if it took the whole national army to do it. All commanding points 2 or 3 miles to the south, southeast and southwest were strongly fortified. It was expected in case of necessity to connect these forts by rifle pits. They were laid out on a scale that would have required 100,000 men to fully man them. It was probably thought that a final battle of the war would be fought at that point. These fortifications were never used. Immediately after the occupation of Corinth by the national troops, General Pope was sent in pursuit of the retreating garrison, and General Buell soon followed. Buell was the senior of the two generals and commanded the entire column. The pursuit was kept up for some 30 miles, but did not result in the capture of any material of war or prisoners, unless a few stragglers who had fallen behind and were willing captives. On the 10th of June, the pursuing column was all back at Corinth. The Army of the Tennessee was not engaged in any of these movements. The Confederates were now driven out of West Tennessee, and on the 6th of June, after a well-contested naval battle, the national forces took possession of Memphis and held the Mississippi River from its source to that point. The railroad from Columbus to Corinth was at once put in good condition and held by us. We had garrisons at Donelson, Clarksville, and Nashville on the Cumberland River, and held the Tennessee River from its mouth to Eastport. New Orleans and Baton Rouge had fallen into the possession of the national forces, so that now the Confederates at the west were narrowed down for all communication with Richmond to the single line of road running east from Vicksburg. To dispossess them of this, therefore, became a matter of the first importance. The possession of the Mississippi by us from Memphis to Baton Rouge was also a most important object. It would be equal to the amputation of a limb in its weakening effects upon the enemy. After the capture of Corinth, a movable force of 80,000 men, besides enough to hold all the territory acquired, could have been set in motion for the accomplishment of any great campaign for the suppression of the rebellion. In addition to this, fresh troops were being raised to swell the effective force. But the work of depletion commenced. Buell with the Army of the Ohio was sent east, following the line of the Memphis and Charleston Railroad. This he was ordered to repair as he advanced, only to have it destroyed by small guerrilla bands or other troops as soon as he was out of the way. If he had been sent directly to Chattanooga as rapidly as he could march, leaving 2 or 3 divisions along the line of the railroad from Nashville forward, he could have arrived with but little fighting, and would have saved much of the loss of life which was afterwards incurred in gaining Chattanooga. Bragg would then not have had time to raise an army to contest the possession of Middle and East Tennessee and Kentucky. The battles of Stone River and Chickamauga would not necessarily have been fought. Burnside would not have been besieged in Knoxville without the power of helping himself or escaping. The Battle of Chattanooga would not have been fought. These are the negative advantages, if the term negative is applicable, which would probably have resulted from prompt movements after Corinth fell into the possession of the national forces. The positive results might have been a bloodless advance to Atlanta, to Vicksburg, or to any other desired point south of Corinth in the interior of Mississippi. My position at Corinth, with a nominal command and yet no command, became so unbearable that I asked permission of Halleck to remove my headquarters to Memphis. I had repeatedly asked, between the fall of Donelson and the evacuation of Corinth, to be relieved from duty under Halleck, but all my applications were refused until the occupation of the town. I then obtained permission to leave the department, but General Sherman happened to call on me as I was about starting and urged me so strongly not to think of going that I concluded to remain. My application to be permitted to remove my headquarters to Memphis was, however, approved, and on the 21st of June I started for that point with my staff and a cavalry escort of only a part of 1 company. There was a detachment of 2 or 3 companies going some 25 miles west to be stationed as a guard to the railroad. I went under cover of this escort to the end of their march, and the next morning proceeded to Lagrange with no convoy but the few cavalrymen I had with me. From Lagrange to Memphis, the distance is 47 miles. There were no troops stationed between these 2 points, except a small force guarding a working party which was engaged in repairing the railroad. Not knowing where this party would be found, I halted at Lagrange. General Hurlbut was in command there at the time and had his headquarters tents pitched on the lawn of a very commodious country house. The proprietor was at home and, learning of my arrival, he invited General Hurlbut and me to dine with him. I accepted the invitation and spent a very pleasant afternoon with my host, who was a thorough Southern gentleman fully convinced of the justice of secession. After dinner, seated in the capacious porch, he entertained me with a recital of the services he was rendering the cause. He was too old to be in the ranks himself. He must have been quite 70 then, but his means enabled him to be useful in other ways. In ordinary times, the homestead where he was now living produced the bread and meat to supply the slaves on his main plantation in the lowlands of Mississippi. Now he raised food and forage on both places, and thought he would have that year a surplus sufficient to feed 300 families of poor men who had gone into the war and left their families dependent upon the patriotism of those better off. The crops around me looked fine, and I had at the moment an idea that about the time they were ready to be gathered, the Yankee troops would be in the neighbourhood and harvest them for the benefit of those engaged in the suppression of the rebellion instead of its support. I felt, however, the greatest respect for the candour of my host and for his zeal in a cause he thoroughly believed in, though our views were as wide apart as it is possible to conceive. The 23rd of June, 1862, on the road from Lagrange to Memphis was very warm, even for that latitude and season. With my staff and small escort, I started at an early hour, and before noon we arrived within 20 miles of Memphis. At this point, I saw a very comfortable-looking white-haired gentleman seated at the front of his house, a little distance from the road. I let my staff and escort ride ahead while I halted and, for an excuse, asked for a glass of water. I was invited at once to dismount and come in. I found my host very genial and communicative, and stayed longer than I had intended, until the lady of the house announced dinner and asked me to join them. The host, however, was not pressing, so that I declined the invitation, and mounting my horse rode on. About a mile west from where I had been stopping, a road comes up from the southeast, joining that from Lagrange to Memphis. A mile west of this junction, I found my staff and escort halted and enjoying the shade of forest trees on the lawn of a house located several hundred feet back from the road, their horses hitched to the fence along the line of the road. I, too, stopped, and we remained there until the cool of the afternoon, and then rode into Memphis. The gentleman with whom I had stopped 20 miles from Memphis was a Mr. Deloche, a man loyal to the Union. He had not pressed me to tarry longer with him, because in the early part of my visit, a neighbour, a Dr. Smith, had called, and, on being presented to me, backed off the porch as if something had hit him. Mr. Deloche knew that the rebel General Jackson was in that neighbourhood with a detachment of cavalry. His neighbour was as earnest in the Southern cause as was Mr. Deloche in that of the Union. The exact location of Jackson was entirely unknown to Mr. Deloche, but he was sure that his neighbour would know it and would give information of my presence, and this made my stay unpleasant to him after the call of Dr. Smith. I have stated that a detachment of troops was engaged in guarding workmen who were repairing the railroad east of Memphis. On the day I entered Memphis, Jackson captured a small herd of beef cattle which had been sent east for the troops so engaged. The drovers were not enlisted men, and he released them. A day or two after, one of these drovers came to my headquarters and, relating the circumstances of his capture, said Jackson was very much disappointed that he had not captured me, that he was 6 or 7 miles south of the Memphis and Charleston Railroad when he learned that I was stopping at the house of Mr. Deloche, and had ridden with his command to the junction of the road he was on with that from Lagrange and Memphis, where he learned that I had passed 3/4 of an hour before. He thought it would be useless to pursue with jaded horses a well-mounted party with so much of a start. Had he gone 3/4 of a mile farther, he would have found me with my party quietly resting under the shade of trees, and without even arms in our hands with which to defend ourselves. General Jackson, of course, did not communicate his disappointment at not capturing me to a prisoner, a young drover, but from the talk among the soldiers, the facts related were learned. A day or two later, Mr. Deloche called on me in Memphis to apologize for his apparent incivility in not insisting on my staying for dinner. He said that his wife accused him of marked discourtesy, but that after the call of his neighbour he had felt restless until I got away. I never met General Jackson before the war, nor during it, but have met him since at his very comfortable summer home at Manitou Springs, Colorado. I reminded him of the above incident, and this drew from him the response that he was thankful now he had not captured me. I certainly was very thankful too. My occupation of Memphis as district headquarters did not last long. The period, however, was marked by a few incidents which were novel to me. Up to that time I had not occupied any place in the South where the citizens were at home in any great numbers. Dover was within the fortifications at Fort Donelson, and, as far as I remember, every citizen was gone. There were no people living at Pittsburgh Landing, and but very few at Corinth. Memphis, however, was a populous city, and there were many of the citizens remaining there who were not only thoroughly impressed with the justice of their cause, but who thought that even the Yankee soldiery must entertain the same views if they could only be induced to make an honest confession. It took hours of my time every day to listen to complaints and requests. The latter were generally reasonable, and if so, they were granted. But the complaints were not always, or even often, well-founded. 2 instances will mark the general character. First, the officer who commanded at Memphis immediately after the city fell into the hands of the national troops had ordered one of the churches of the city to be opened to the soldiers. Army chaplains were authorized to occupy the pulpit. Second, at the beginning of the war, the Confederate Congress had passed a law confiscating all property of alien enemies at the South, including the debts of Southerners to Northern men. In consequence of this law, when Memphis was occupied, the Provost Marshal had forcibly collected all the evidences he could obtain of such debts. Almost the first complaints made to me were these 2 outrages. The gentleman who made the complaints informed me first of his own high standing as a lawyer, a citizen, and a Christian. He was a deacon in the church which had been defiled by the occupation of Union troops, and by a Union chaplain filling the pulpit. He did not use the word defile, but he expressed the idea very clearly. He asked that the church be restored to the former congregation. I told him that no order had been issued prohibiting the congregation attending the church. He said of course the congregation could not hear a northern clergyman who differed so radically with them on questions of government. I told him the troops would continue to occupy that church for the present, and that they would not be called upon to hear disloyal sentiments proclaimed from the pulpit. This closed the argument on the first point. Then came the second. The complainant said that he wanted the papers restored to him which had been surrendered to the Provost Marshal under protest. He was a lawyer, and before the establishment of the Confederate States government had been the attorney for a number of large business houses at the North. That his government had confiscated all debts due alien enemies and appointed commissioners or officers to collect such debts and pay them over to the government. But in his case, owing to his high standing, he had been permitted to hold these claims for collection, the responsible officials knowing that he would account to the government for every dollar received. He said that his government, when it came in possession of all its territory, would hold him personally responsible for the claims he had surrendered to the Provost Marshal. His impudence was so sublime that I was rather amused than indignant. I told him, however, that if he would remain in Memphis, I did not believe the Confederate government would ever molest him. He left, no doubt, as much amazed at my assurance as I was at the brazenness of his request. On the 11th of July, General Halleck received telegraphic orders appointing him to the command of all the armies, with headquarters in Washington. His instructions pressed him to proceed to his new field of duty with as little delay as was consistent with the safety and interests of his previous command. I was next in rank, and he telegraphed me the same day to report at department headquarters at Corinth. I was not informed by the dispatch that my chief had been ordered to a different field, and did not know whether to move my headquarters or not. I telegraphed asking if I was to take my staff with me, and received word in reply, "This place will be your headquarters. You can judge for yourself." I left Memphis for my new field without delay, and reached Corinth on the 15th of the month. General Halleck remained until the 17th of July, but he was very uncommunicative and gave me no information as to what I had been called to Corinth for. When General Halleck left to assume the duties of General-in-Chief, I remained in command of the District of West Tennessee. Practically, I became a department commander because no one was assigned to that position over me, and I made my reports direct to the General-in-Chief. But I was not assigned to the position of department commander until the 25th of October. General Halleck, while commanding the Department of the Mississippi, had had control as far east as a line drawn from Chattanooga north. My district only embraced West Tennessee and Kentucky, west of the Cumberland River. Buell, with the Army of the Ohio, had, as previously stated, been ordered east towards Chattanooga, with instructions to repair the Memphis and Charleston Railroad as he advanced. Troops had been sent north by Halleck along the line of the Mobile and Ohio Railroad to put it in repair as far as Columbus. Other troops were stationed on the railroad from Jackson, Tennessee, to Grand Junction, and still others on the road west to Memphis. The remainder of the magnificent army of 120,000 men which entered Corinth on the 30th of May had now become so scattered that I was put entirely on the defensive in a territory whose population was hostile to the Union. One of the first things I had to do was to construct fortifications at Corinth better suited to the garrison that could be spared to man them. The structures that had been built during the months of May and June were left as monuments to the skill of the engineer, and others were constructed in a few days, plainer in design, but suited to the command available to defend them. I disposed the troops belonging to the district in conformity with the situation as rapidly as possible. The forces at Donelson, Clarksville, and Nashville, with those at Corinth and along the railroad eastward, I regarded as sufficient for protection against any attack from the west. The Mobile and Ohio Railroad was guarded from Rienzi, south of Corinth to Columbus, and the Mississippi Central Railroad from Jackson, Tennessee to Bolivar. Grand Junction and LaGrange on the Memphis Railroad were abandoned. South of the Army of the Tennessee, and confronting it, was Van Dorn, with a sufficient force to organize a movable army of 35,000 to 40,000 men, after being reinforced by Price from Missouri. This movable force could be thrown against either Corinth, Bolivar, or Memphis, and the best that could be done in such event would be to weaken the points not threatened in order to reinforce the one that was. Nothing could be gained on the national side by attacking elsewhere because the territory already occupied was as much as the force present could guard.